Sophie, thank you.
Now, new research has found that chief executives of FTSE 100 companies earn on average nearly 200 times the pay of their workers. Bosses of leading companies earned on average almost £5 million each in 2014. That is 183 times the average pay of workers. That's up from 160 times the multiple in 2010. Between them, the top 10 highest paid chief executives earned more than £150 million. Well, Deborah Hargreaves is director of the High Pay Centre. She says salaries should account for the responsibilities of all workers.
Partly the reason why it's so high is because CEO tenure has become quite short, so 5 years on average, and that's because, you know, they do tend to go if things go wrong. And so no one disputes the fact that it's a high-profile, very responsible job and that they should be paid a lot more for doing it. But let's also not forget that someone who comes in every day has a lot vested in that job. You know, if they lose their job, they lose virtually everything. So we're saying, why don't we spread the rewards a little bit more fairly? You know, we've seen workforce wages held down for many years now.
That was Deborah Hargreaves. Let's get the thoughts now of Kate Andrews from the free market think tank, the Adam Smith Institute. Kate, good morning to you. When we interviewed Deborah Hargreaves a while ago, we tried to get her to give the right multiple in her mind. What would be the right multiple? 183 times the average salary at the moment. It's gone up from 160. In America, it's 300. What was the right multiple? She couldn't give an answer, and that's part of the problem, isn't it? Who will decide what the correct multiple is? How do you go about doing that?
Well, it's no decision that you or I, or I think anybody talking about this issue, can make as a one-off. It's completely subjective about the company and who the CEO is, and most importantly, what value they can bring to that company later on. That value can result in higher profits for the company. Sure, it can result in more jobs as well, and most importantly, it can result as better products going out to consumers at the end of the day. CEO pay can be linked to the products that we're getting out into the public. It's individuals at the top who are making very important decisions that will affect what products come to play for their company and what is being serviced to the public.
What do you make of the argument that we obsess a bit too much with the sort of CEO world, and then actually there are many chief executive officers out there whose influence is not that dramatic, who don't add that much value? They're placemen, they're yes-men, they're people who've worked their way up through a chain. They've found themselves by serendipity in the top job, and they don't really warrant that kind of pay.
Well, that's suggesting that shareholders and investors at the top who are determining CEO salaries aren't paying attention to the work that that CEO is doing. And frankly, I don't think it's a very rational argument. This idea that CEOs can just shield away from their shareholders and investors the actual work that they're doing just doesn't seem to be the case. These shareholders have an invested interest in, making the CEO as profitable as possible. And if they're not cutting their weight, then they're probably going to get cut. Steve Jobs is an excellent example of somebody who showed the positives and negatives that can happen to a CEO over the course of a lifetime. He was let go from Apple when he decided to invest in very expensive computers that couldn't compete with Microsoft, which was selling them for significantly less. But then when the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, they brought him back, and he had to make some very serious gambles about what products people would want to consume. But he decided to gamble on the iPod. He decided to gamble on the iPhone, and it made Apple billions.
Yeah. What do you make of the brain drain argument, Kate, this idea that if we capped CEO salaries in this country, they're part of a globalised tribe, they'd just up sticks and move somewhere else? I mentioned the multiple in America. The CEO there, on average, earns 300 times that of the average worker. They might just move to America, get paid more.
I think it's a good point. It isn't just a case about moving to America or moving to a different country. These companies are operating on global scales now, regardless of whether or not they're based in the UK. And it would be silly to think that a company would just leave altogether. But, what these numbers are really looking at is not specifically where the person is located, but what value that company is bringing to a global community. And let's remember that in that global community, things are getting more and more competitive. I don't think it is the case that CEOs can just rest at the top now and nobody's going to notice what they're doing. They have to be competitive in this global market. The issue isn't really whether or not they're going to get out of America. The issue is whether or not that company in itself is going to continue to be prosperous against its competitors.
We tend to know, Kate, don't we now, what CEOs are getting, because shareholders, as you suggest, take a view on that. What does Adam Smith tell us about transparency in perfect markets? I mean, part of what the High Pay Commission and others are saying is that we ought to know now what everybody in a big company is actually earning. I mean, presumably that kind of degree of transparency would make for a more perfect market. It might make managers' life a complete nightmare.
Well, transparency is most important when other people's money is being spent, and I think we have to recognize that there is definitely a line between what should remain public and private. And if we were talking about bonuses and salaries of managers and chief executives in a public sector business, then I think transparency would be absolutely invaluable. People should know what their money is going towards, whether or not taxpayers' money is being wasted on massive bonuses, and whether or not too much is going into that public service. But when we're talking about completely private companies in the private sphere, I think it's safe to say that these numbers can remain private if they feel that that's the need. But, you know, a lot of these companies are putting those numbers out there. I don't think that they are particularly ashamed of the amount of money that their CEOs are making, because if you look at the value of the company, it's billions more than the CEO is making. And that money does translate to what you and I consume on a day-to-day basis. It's not in vain, and it's not simply to fund somebody else to go off and live on a yacht or, you know, fly their own private plane. These numbers do end up qualifying to what you and I are consuming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper for us every day.
Kate Andrews, thanks very much indeed.
One of Sepp Blatter's fiercest and most persistent critics has launched his bid for the FIFA presidency today.
The real reason FIFA has become such a corrupt organization is because the same person has been running it for 40 years. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. After